Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video I'll be talking about my opinions on The Amazing Race Season 3 after my most recent rewatch. Continuing on with this revisiting series, so let's just jump right into it. Production wise, this season was very similar to that of the last season in terms of the editing and production value. There were a couple format changes like a 12 team cast instead of 11 and one less non-elimination leg, but what really makes the season really notable for me is its iconic cast. And some of the most iconic characters of the entire series are on this season, even though I will say that I do think there are a couple duds on this season as well. But we'll talk about all that as we run through the episodes, which I might as well start right now. So let's start off with the premiere, where we start off with the same sort of intro from seasons 1 and 2, similar editing style, similar music, but this time it's in the Everglades for some reason. So that's something. Heather and Eve have a pretty good amount of airtime here where they're openly using their looks to their advantage by begging for money, the airport and stuff, and that's a pretty fun scene. We also right away in this premiere get a good glimpse into what is to come with Flo, who kind of like Tara and Will, I feel like is a very focal point of the season and a major factor in whether or not you're going to enjoy this season as a whole. And for me personally, I really enjoy Flo as a character, even though, again, I know some people do find her a bit annoying. Ken and Gerrard have a pretty fun introduction here as well with their interactions with Derek and Drew. And speaking of Derek and Drew, they got off to a really rough start here despite doing pretty well later on in the season. I mean, they almost go home here, but instead the boots of this episode are Gina and Sylvia, and outside of them being moms, I know nothing about them. They did get that moment where they found this kid in a store and one of the two had a breakdown over missing their kid, which I just found this a really strange scene, especially the fact that she's just holding this kid, this random kid in the middle of the store is completely ridiculous. Where are her parents? It's why is she just randomly carrying a random kid? Again, just a strange scene, but overall, again, I was fine with them leaving. They didn't really bring much to the table. Episode 2 was okay, an all-around solid episode of the show, but nothing overly spectacular about it. I mean, we did get some fun moments from teams like Andre and Damien. I mean, Derek and Drew went from last to first. We had some minor Flo moments, not nearly as much as what we would get later on in the season. But Aaron and Ariane got a good amount of screen time in this episode. They have the iconic Girls Gone Wild scene. But in this episode, we do lose Tremel and Talisha. And I mean, I love them. They're so amazing. I think they're probably my favorite team in the history of the race to go out within the first few episodes. I mean, they're fantastic TV. And it's such a shame that we didn't get to see more of them. I mean, they pretty much feel like characters from a parody film. But, I mean, they're actual people. Obviously, I do think they were playing it up for the camera, especially Tremel. I feel like there are times where he's, pretty blatantly hamming it up. But I still found them to be really fun characters, even though, obviously, they were terrible racers. Episode 3 was, again, pretty solid. I mean, the elimination was really obvious here, but there were fun moments within the episode. We did get the start of the Twin Hunt Alliance, along with Ken and Gerrard furthering their bond with the twins. The airport stuff took up a good chunk of this episode as everyone was struggling to find a flight, which does lead to Dennis and Andrew getting really far behind. We did get some fighting between Heather and Eve, and we also had some Flo moments, as we typically would. But the episode ends with the showdown between Andre and Damien and Terry and Ian, and again, it didn't matter. It really didn't matter because Dennis and Andrew were so far behind. But it's pretty funny that even with the fast forward, Dennis and Andrew were still in last place. And I found it really strange, this scene at the end of the episode where for some reason after you finish the fast forward, you get put in a limo and they drive you in a limo to the pit stop. It's why was that a thing? But Dennis and Andrew on the season, I felt like they were two of the bigger duds to me. I mean, they didn't really get that much screen time until this episode. I mean, Andrew seemed to have a good amount of fun energy about him, but outside of that, I mean, they were pretty invisible. And while I do think they have an interesting story, it never really played much of a factor on the show. So again, them leaving didn't really harm the overall season. Episode 4 was, again, another solid episode. I think that's one of the things with season 3 here is that I just feel like it's very consistently solid. I feel like there are very few episodes that are mind-blowingly great, but it's just consistently good the entire way through. But episode 4 did start off pretty slow. I think the first 2/3 of the episode are kind of pointless as there is an equalizer very late into the episode But there are some fun moments like Derek and Drew and Ken and Gerrard taking a massive risk to arrive slightly quicker, which again didn't end up mattering. And at the detour, there was the stuff with Heather and Eve crashing their car and Andre and Damien being trapped by them and them having to help Heather and Eve finish the detour. That was fun. But again, the meat and bones of the episode come after the equalizer, where everyone is rushing to the detour, and Aaron and Ariane and Terry and Ian end up being pretty far behind. And I don't understand why they chose Ariane to do the roadblock. Like, this was really dumb. Again, this is at a point in Amazing Race history where anyone can do any number of roadblocks. There was no limit on it yet. So the fact that they made Ariane do this soccer challenge was really dumb to me. I mean, especially because Aaron's like a big, like sort of lanky guy. You would think that he would definitely be a better body type for this challenge, but whatever. And yeah, because of that, they do end up being last. But Heather and Eve, who technically arrived first, did read the clue incorrectly, I guess. I think it's more of them not understanding the clue. But because of the penalty that they got from that, they end up eliminated. And this entire section of the episode was very strange, where there was some very blatant voiceover from Phil when telling the teams their placements. So I don't understand why that was necessary. And then we also get the weird editing of when Aaron and Ariane arrive at the pit stop. We just cut to the sit down with Phil, where Phil reveals what happened. And this entire debacle just felt very poorly edited, and I really don't understand why. I mean, I'm kind of thinking what happened is that they realized Heather and Eve's mistake and gave them a penalty, and as all the other teams were coming in, they were saying their actual placement. But in the editing room, I guess they thought it would be better if they had Heather and Eve come in first and then for them not to reveal it until the end. I don't know. It feels weird. I don't understand why, but that is something that I guess they did. But Heather and Eve as characters, I thought they were pretty fun in the show. I mean, the premiere had them begging for money at the airport. That was cool. I thought they had some pretty fun arguing. They were a pretty big part of these early episodes of the season. And they're also the first team ever to get eliminated due to a penalty from not reading the clue correctly. So that's something, I guess. But now for episode 5, which I think had one particular high point. But outside of that, I do think it was a bit of a slower episode. We did have some fun moments from Terry and Ian's arguing, and again, Flo's freak out at the cliff. But the most memorable part of this episode was the diesel gas debacle, where the cars that they were driving ran on diesel gas, but only like half the teams realized that. So because of that, 4 of the teams were stuck in the middle of the road and were forced to deal with this situation. I felt like it was really fun to see all these different teams deal with it in a different way. And it's because of this debacle that we lose Michael and Kathy. And I don't get how Michael and Kathy thought that waiting until morning was the best way to approach this situation. I mean, they obviously ended up being way behind the other teams, and that's kind of the way that they played this entire season. They were just too cautious and really passive the entire way through. And I also found them to be some of the least dynamic characters of the season, as they pretty much got along the entire time. But I was surprised to see how much screen time they got. I really didn't remember that, but on the rewatch, you really notice that they're definitely up there for the most screen time up to this point in the season, which is really weird when we have teams like Flo and Zach and Terry and Ian, who up to this point in the season were kind of just fine. But now for episode 6, which was a pretty weak episode in my opinion. I mean, it was mostly void of drama or fun moments. I believe this is the first time the replacement car rule was openly talked about on the show, which will be repeated a billion times from this point on. A few points of interest from this episode came from Flo and Ian arguing over that taxi, and a more iconic moment in Andre and Damon getting detained, but I think that moment just sounds a lot better than it actually is on the show. The show presents it more as an afterthought, as most of the information is told to us through confessionals, so I didn't find this moment as entertaining as you would think it would be. And the boot for this episode was very obvious, where Aaron and Ariane never recovered from the previous episode, so that also kind of led to this episode being a bit weaker. But I really liked Aaron and Ariane on this season. I mean, they were pretty big figures during those first few episodes. They brought really fun commentary, and they were the ones to create the Twin Hunt Alliance, even though that storyline gets dropped pretty soon afterwards. Now, I don't think they're nearly as entertaining towards the end of their run. Once they start getting on the bottom, like all their fun is kind of zapped from them. But I feel like they're a team that I would have liked to see race again, even though at this point it's probably never going to happen. Now for episode 7, which was kind of another slower episode. I mean, and again, when I'm saying slower episodes here, they're not that bad. I mean, they're definitely better than like the slower episodes from seasons 1 and 2. It's just in comparison to some of these other episodes, I do find them a bit slower. But this episode had some arguing from Andre and Damon at the airport. That was a good scene. And Flo and Zach arguing over the hotel. Derek and Drew fighting over their map towards the end of the episode. This is also the episode where we get like the first hints of the Flo and Drew romance, so that's something. Ken and Gerrard did get a flat tire at the very end of the episode, and them thinking that they were in last only to come in fifth, that was a pretty fun moment as well. But Andre and Damien go home, and this was another one where that was pretty well telegraphed the entire way through. And for me, they were probably the most forgettable team left, but yeah, I was surprised at how much screen time they got. I mean, particularly in these last few episodes, it felt like they were a major factor in these episodes. But again, outside of them being detained and their like parasitic sort of gameplay, I don't feel like they made that much of an impact. Now for episode 8, which was the first non-elimination leg, which was a surprisingly good episode. I mean, we did get more of the looming Flo and Drew romance, and we got a pretty fun sequence where all the teams but John, Vito, and Jill left their bags on the boat, and to get their bags back, they would have to wait for their boat to return, which it couldn't return because Jill was holding their boat there, and that caused all the other teams to have to wait for them, which gave John, Vito, and Jill a bit of a lead for a little bit. I think that was a fun sequence, even though, again, didn't really end up mattering as there was an equalizer pretty soon afterwards. And the episode pretty much came down to a foot race to the finish, and I thought that was a fun way to end the episode with John, Vito, and Jill in sight as Ken and Gerrard arrived at the pit stop. But again, it was a non-elimination leg, so it didn't really matter at the end of the day. Now for episode 9, which was a 2-hour episode, also known as just 2 episodes back to back, where the first leg was a non-elimination leg, and I found this leg pretty slow. I mean, we did get to see John, Vito, and Jill eat cheese, so that's something. And this was the leg where the teams were able to call home, which was a really weird thing to see. But the best part of the episode for me was the race to the pit stop, where Flo had this really big meltdown, and spoiler alert, it definitely won't be the last one, but she gets really upset at Zach for like unzipping his pants and for losing to 2 retired people. But again, it was a non-elimination episode, so it didn't really matter. But I do feel like Flo and Zach get extremely lucky here, where this is the first ever back-to-back non-elimination leg. Second leg was pretty much all about Flo and Zach. And to be honest, from this point on, the entire show is Flo and Zach, where this is where the Flo and Drew storyline becomes very prevalent, where Flo needs to have a hotel so they all get one room together, and we have Flo and Drew sleeping in one bed while Zach slept with Derek. It was a really weird scene. We also had Flo getting upset at Zach for not giving Ken and Gerrard the map, which is a pretty incredible scene as well. I mean, this is also the first time that Zach actually fights back, that he gets mad at Flo, and that's pretty fun. Like, outside of Flo and Zach, though, I mean, the other teams didn't really get that much content. John, Vito, and Jill do end up going home here, and I really don't get the love for John, Vito, and Jill. I mean, out of those on All-Stars, I feel like they're the biggest head scratchers for me. I never understood why people enjoyed them on the show. They're just so boring. I mean, I get that they're underdogs, but I just felt like there were more interesting characters that you could have brought back for All-Stars over them. I mean, they really brought no entertainment to this entire season. They were very replacement level racers. I just don't get why they were fan favorites. But again, that's just me. But now for the penultimate episode of the season, which was a very strong one. And this entire end game, this entire end section of the season is really great. I mean, we get some fun moments from Derek and Drew trying to steal Ken and Gerrard's car, Flo and Zach getting into plenty of arguments in this episode over Zach's passiveness in the race. And speaking of that, I mean, I might as well mention this. I don't understand how this late into the race, Flo and Zach are still buying tickets for the twins. Like, obviously there is the Flo and Drew romance, and that's a factor here, but it's really ridiculous that Zach is allowing this to happen, that they're actively helping their biggest competition this late into the race. But whatever. Back third of the episode is really fun as well, kind of reminiscent of the race to the finish line back when Heather and Eve got eliminated, where both Ken and Gerrard and Derek and Drew get lost looking for a roadblock. And I love that this is where Ken and Gerrard made their move that they've been talking about throughout the season, where they keep on talking about how they needed to cut Derek and Drew at some point. And this is the point where they let Derek and Drew get on the boat too early, making Derek and Drew arrive at the pit stop, making them have to turn back and go and do the task. And they get eliminated due to all the time they lost here. I mean, to be fair, they were already kind of in the back anyway, but this really just solidified it. And I mean, the twins on their own weren't the most interesting characters on the season, but I feel like the circumstances of the race made them interesting. They did argue at points, mostly due to them messing up with directions, but what made them a lot more interesting was their relationships with like Flo and Zach and Ken and Gerrard, and also the other teams ganging up on them at the beginning of the season. But most of these things had nothing to do with the actual actions of Derek and Drew, but they were solid racers that had a major weakness in their sense of direction. But again, thank God they didn't win. I mean, if they had won this season, I think it would have been very tough to watch having three very similar winning teams back to back to back on the show for the first 3 seasons of the show. And considering season 4, spoiler, has a very similar style of winner, I do think this would have been a very tough streak of the show to watch. But now let's get into the finale, which, like last season, did include 2 legs. The first leg is entirely about Flo and her breakdown. And without that, it would have been a pretty boring leg, but with that, it becomes one of the most fun legs in the history of the show. I mean, right when the leg starts, we get Flo wanting to quit and feeling dehydrated and not wanting to get on the train and getting annoyed at the loud music and being upset at not having first class tickets, and it all culminates in this complete meltdown at the detour, where she wants to quit, and Zach essentially has to drag her through this leg. And they do end up coming in last, but it was obviously a non-elimination leg anyway. But yeah, I think this is another point where Flo and Zach get relatively lucky. If this breakdown was on any other leg, they would have been eliminated. But we do get to the final leg, which starts off really fun with all the travel agency drama, where Ian's kind of being a dick and being really domineering, and then we follow that up with Flo and Zach only being able to get business class tickets. And Zach once again saves the day by borrowing someone's phone on the train and is able to get an even better flight. And once we get to Hawaii, Flo is back to her old ways again. Not threatening to quit or anything, but still being very loud and argumentative with Zach. But somehow they win the season. I mean, mostly due to them being able to find a cab quicker than the other teams. But they win, and they're really strange winners for the season. But at the same time, I do think the season wouldn't have been nearly as satisfying without them being the winners. While I love the other 2 teams as well, Flo and Zach winning makes it such a great narrative for the season, especially since they were pretty much the stars of this back third of the season. But let's talk about the final 3, starting off with Ken and Gerrard. And I love Ken and Gerrard. I think it's a travesty that they weren't on All Stars. I mean, they're up there with some of my favorite teams of all time. I mean, they were very solid racers. They were really fun personalities. They knew how to strategically maneuver around the game like this, building an alliance with Derek and Drew and cutting them at the end when the time was right. They had some of the best confessionals in the series' history, and I would really like to see them race again. But again, at this point, it's been so many years, it's very unlikely. And as I said, I think it's a shame they weren't on All-Stars. I mean, if I were to guess, I would say Ken and Gerrard were fighting for the same spot as Kevin and Drew, or even Team Guido, but I feel like production probably thought those teams were too iconic. But again, I really want to see Ken and Gerrard back. I know Phil is a big fan of them, has been fighting to get them back, but it has never happened. I don't know. We'll see. Probably will never happen, but I would really like it. Terry and Ian, or I think it's technically Ian, right? But whatever. Or fantastic characters as well. I didn't really mention this earlier, but this Final 3 is definitely up there with the best Final 3s character-wise in the show's history. I mean, it might even be number 1, where all 3 of these teams are really iconic teams, and Terry and Ian do obviously return for All-Stars, and while I don't think that they were locks for All-Stars for me, they were definitely entertaining on the show with Ian's domineering personality and Terry fighting back with him. And obviously they were kind of this like old couple that actually almost won. And I feel like because of that, I can understand why they were on All-Stars. And finally, we have Flo and Zach. And obviously Flo is an all-time great character on reality TV. And while Zach, I feel like, is a pretty boring character on his own, I feel like his dynamic with Flo really makes him iconic as well. I mean, it is really weird to think that Flo is the first female winner of The Amazing Race, with all of her meltdowns and threatening to quit. Now, as racers, Flo and Zach are very mediocre winners in my eyes. I do think they're a good team together, where Flo and Zach obviously have completely different strengths, and I think that is a major factor in why they won. I mean, Flo is very good socially, she's having great relationships with the other teams, and a bit more aggressive in getting what she wants, while Zach is a lot more passive, but kept a good attitude and never really gave up. And again, I think they're a good team, but they did get very lucky on this season. They got saved by a non-elimination leg at the final 5, which literally came after another non-elimination leg. Again, something completely unprecedented at that point. They had Flo's complete breakdown at the final 3, which would have lost them the race on any other leg. But, I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of how The Amazing Race goes. So those are my opinions on The Amazing Race Season 3, which is a great season of reality television. I mean, the best season of the show so far, mostly due to having some really iconic characters. I mean, I rarely found the season, boring, which happened quite often in the previous ones. Again, this is a much more consistent season, but I will say I don't think I loved it as much as I did the first time I watched it, or last time I watched it, I should say. And I don't know what it is. I just remember last time I watched it, I came out of it thinking this is one of the best seasons of The Amazing Race ever. But by the time I made my season ranking video, it dropped from number 2 to number 5. And while I don't know exactly where the placement stands now, I do stand with the sentiment that I had at the time of my season ranking video. I mean, it's still positive. I still love this season. I think it's a great season of television, but it's just slightly less than what it used to be. So that's it for season 3 of The Amazing Race. Stay tuned for hopefully a video on season 4 next month. We'll see, hopefully. But for now, thank you for watching.